Brownback session. Thank you so much, Deb, for graciously agreeing to talk to us all about crowdfunding and how we might be able to employ this tool to help support our research. So Professor Verhoeven wears many hats. I won't go through all of them because that might take the entire hour. So she is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and Cultural Informatics and is the Professor of Digital Humanities and Women's Gender Studies at the University of Alberta. She's also the director of the Humanities Networked Infrastructure Project and has served as the Associate Dean of Engagement and Innovation in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences in UTS here in Sydney. She has tremendous experience and expertise in several areas such as big data, digital infrastructure, as well as the film and creative industry, and relevant to today's talk in crowdfunding and how academic research can utilize crowdfunding. So here at IPPE, we've recently been talking about how to get money for research through avenues other than ARC grants, for instance. And so crowdfunding may have potential impact and potential for us. So I'd like to hand over to you now, Deb, and thank you so much again for being here.
Thanks everyone for your patience and for being a fantastic example of something I am going to talk about in 1 second, which is crowdsourcing as opposed to crowdfunding. But I think we just collectively solved a problem that I was having. So many grateful props and doffs of hat to everyone who helped then. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some crowdfunding experiences I've had, 3 different styles of thinking about crowdfunding in universities. I will put a caveat up front saying that I haven't been involved in a great deal of crowdfunding activity for a couple of years, and it's a reasonably fast-moving field. So please consider some of what I'm talking about, I guess, as preparatory groundwork for perhaps what might need to be some more contemporary thinking around crowdfunding. So as I mentioned, I want to kind of think about this in relation to just being very clear about nomenclature. So there's crowdsourcing, which is not crowdfunding, although they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can, and in fact, one of the case studies I'll talk about did both. Crowdsourcing is where you have distributed problem solving, and it's sometimes called microtasking. Crowdfunding, on the other hand, is distributed financing. So we often refer to that as microfunding or microfinancing. And it really emerged in the great global financial crisis of 2008 as a contemporary way of thinking about leveraging or greenlighting projects. But it has a very long history. And it probably would surprise people to learn that the Statue of Liberty was in fact crowdfunded. And it's a great story. The publisher, Joseph Pulitzer, who was running at the time the New York World, wanted to assist in having the statue erected and appealed to New Yorkers to fund this. And it's a wonderful example of microfinancing. Children would send pennies taped to the backs of envelopes and things like this in order to have the Statue of Liberty finally erected. Again, people aren't necessarily aware, but the Sydney Opera House was established on the basis of a kind of a community funding campaign, and one that had really interesting repercussions for privacy legislation in Australia. The Opera House lottery was won by someone in the mid-1960s whose child was then kidnapped and held to ransom for the winnings. That child died, and the beginning of forensic investigations was established around the solving of that particular crime. But also it became illegal to publish the names of lottery winners and people who participated in public funding exercises as a result of that case. Some of you might remember these. They were a very, very early example of a Kickstarter campaign. In fact, they were one of the first and original Kickstarter campaigns. I used to have one. They're no longer in business. They sold out. This is a very famous example of crowdfunding. Someone crowdfunded a potato salad. So a young, fairly facetious early digital entrepreneur, publicly discussed his desire to make a potato salad, and he asked people to help him purchase the ingredients, and he jumped onto Kickstarter. He needed $10 worth of ingredients. He ended up making, you'll never believe this number, about $55,000 crowdfunding his potato salad. And it's examples like this that have given rise to a lot of popular disregard for crowdfunding, and this idea that crowdfunding is a bit of a rort, which we will get to a little bit later. This was a campaign I was involved in. This was the first medical trial that was crowdfunded, the Mighty Maggots project that we did at Deakin University. I think at the time I prepared this presentation a couple of years ago, this was the most expensive crowdfunding campaign, which was to build a skyscraper in, I think it's downtown Bogota, which is was a campaign put together by local traders who felt that having a multi-purpose and multi-story building in their part of the retail district would be an asset to their businesses. And so they initiated this, which has now turned into around the world what we would call equity-sourced crowdfunding. This one people might also remember, it's the Flow Hive, which was a very, very successful Indiegogo crowdfunded project. It raised about $12 million for a very innovative beekeeping system in Australia. And they made much more money than they expected. They originally aimed for 70,000 and ended up with 12 million. So who knew that was a pressing need that many people around the country felt we required a solution to and wanted to participate in. So these are just various lots of examples of what crowdfunding might mean in different contexts. So what are the kind of basic models for crowdfunding? And there's really two. One is a donation model, which is where you will give money to a cause or to a particular project or event, and you don't expect any return on that investment. You may, as a consequence of making your donation, receive what's called an incentive or a reward. So some of you may have participated in these kinds of campaigns where you give money to a filmmaker or a band or a theatre production, and in return you receive a pencil or a t-shirt or some other kind of incentive. It's important to hang on to this thought, because when we come to talk about universities and tax deductibility, this becomes a slightly more complicated and grey area of discussion. The second major way of thinking about crowdfunding is through the investment model. And this is where there's been a lot of more recent activity due to updates in Australian legislation. So these are equity-based or lending-based and sometimes royalty-based, where you, in return for your investment, receive a share of any royalties that are accrued by the project. In Australia, crowdsourced equity funding has been possible since late 2018. And this is an area of pretty significant investment. The largest investment company in this space is an Australian company called Birchall, who are related to the donation-based crowdfunding company Possible. Birchall raised over $70 million for around 100 companies since they launched in 2019. There are some limits on how people can invest. You can't, as an individual investor in an equity-based crowdfunding project, you can't invest more than $10,000 as a cap. You are limited in the kind of business you can be if you source crowdfunding. So you have to be limited to a maximum of a certain size. There are some cost and compliance concessions made to companies that use this model of fundraising. So there's a less onerous compliance regime built around these kinds of ways of raising money. But there are also higher risks. If you think about, I don't know, some of you in Melbourne will know the company Sheba, which was a kind of feminist version of Uber. a women-only rideshare business. They raised about $3 million through equity crowdfunding a few years ago, but were out of business within 2 years. So the education onus on advising investors that startups generally prone to fail, and so this is a high-risk investment, that really falls to the companies themselves, because there's not a high level of literacy around startup culture in the investors who go into this model. So these are just all things to also think about. So there's two basic models, but there's also within those two models a bunch of different techniques for how you encourage people to raise money. There's all or nothing. This is my favorite sort of crowdfunding because it's over and done with when it's done, and you have a goal and a deadline, and you need to reach your financial goal by the deadline, or you get nothing. So it really encourages a lot of effort, but it also encourages people to think within a timeline. Keep it all is where even if you don't reach the predetermined goal, you get to keep your money. There are some risks with keep it all, I think, particularly in this sector. One of the reasons the projects I worked on were principally all or nothing is because when you go out to the community and say, you know, I have a project and it's built on a sound idea that I think you're going to be invested in. I'm going to do X, Y, or Z with the money that you give me. If you don't get all the money, what happens? Do you say, oh, now I'm only going to do X and Y? Or now I'm going to do a little bit of X, a little bit of Y, and a little bit of Z, and so on. And you have a major kind of issue in terms of your ability to assure that those people who have invested in your project that you can actually follow through. So for me, keep all or nothing is a better model than keep it all in this space. That being said, many universities do a keep it all model. So, and they see benefits in that style of funding. Bounty funding is where you essentially put something out to tender and you raise funds on the basis of someone successfully providing the service itself. So it's not so much the funding, but the service that you're focused on in that model. And then there's subscription-based models, which you will have seen through Patreon, which is a quite popular way, for example, of funding journalists and podcasts. And there used to be something called Drip, which I always thought was a terrible name, but Patreon has been very successful. And I think a lot of people do work very successfully under the Patreon model. And that's where you give money on a monthly basis to someone to continue to do what they do, deliver podcasts, become an independent journalist, and so on. In the Australian university space, and this is research produced by Jonathan O'Donnell, who's based at RMIT and did a PhD around Australian crowdfunding in universities. Between about 2011 and 2015, which were the heydays for university crowdfunding projects, there were about 80 campaigns, just under, raising about $500,000. The average project size was just a little under 10 grand with a 72% success rate. This is in the context of the much larger multi-billion-dollar global industry that is crowdfunding. At the time that Jonathan was gathering these statistics, the actual overall crowdfunding industry was worth about $10 billion. So university crowdfunding is a very, very small part of a much larger trend. Jonathan's statistics were also delivered before equity crowdfunding was legal in Australia. So I would expect now that given the possibility for floating an equity-based startup, that these numbers would have shifted quite dramatically. But I think it is really important to remember that the average amount of money you can get or expect to get is quite small or modest. And in fact, the onus is on you to think in the reverse. way to the way you would normally think about research funding. So, and don't ever quote me on this, but when you apply for government research funding, so from the ARC or the NHMRC, in part your task is to think about what the highest possible number is that you could feasibly be expected to undertake your research for. You're aiming for the biggest number that is credible, believable, and will deliver the research. Because you know that for the most part, the process that the ARC will go through is to give you only a percentage of the funding you ask for. So there's always a kind of downward push on the resource that you request through the funding agency. In crowdfunding, it's kind of the opposite. What you're looking at in crowdfunding is coming up with the lowest possible number that you could possibly do the project for, not the highest. And you hope that you will get more than that by running a successful campaign. So you may ask for 5,000, but receive 8, and you get to keep the remaining 3 and do whatever you like with it. So what you're looking for, particularly with Keep It All, is a number that you can credibly expect to raise, and hopefully enlarge or multiply as you keep going. And we found in most cases, by the time we got very good at running these crowdfunding campaigns, we were consistently exceeding the bottom line. And that's not an issue. Most investors are hopeful that you will get more. They want to see the project succeed. They're invested in it. So I think that it requires a slight reversal in the normal way that you think logically about how to make money work for you in terms of your research. So how are these things supported? And there's generally a range of different ways of thinking about the infrastructure for crowdfunding. So research platforms are, or crowdfunding research platforms are generally the way it's done. So there are domain-specific platforms. Experiment.com is one of the biggest. It used to be called MicroRiser. There's a medical crowdfunding platform called medstarter.com. These are global. They tend to work in American environments and contexts. They used to be very limited because they were unable to process funds that came in different currencies. They're now, I think, multi-currency compliant. So that's changed a little bit in recent years. But the thing to know about domain-specific platforms is that they are, aside from the ones I've got here, experiment.com and medstarter.com, they're highly volatile and they tend to go out of business very quickly. So some of you might have heard of Thinkable, which was a research platform that was launched with the University of New South Wales. That's no longer in business. Another one was Petri Dish, no longer in business. So there was just a huge amount of activity in developing platforms, most of which have fallen to the wayside. There are university-specific platforms, so they tend to be driven by the university itself, and they tend to come out of enterprise divisions. And they're often deliberately focused on student projects and startups. Again, they have a volatile life. My attitude has always been never let a university build a platform, because anyone who's ever been to a university website knows how dysfunctional they are, even just to visit. So why would you actually let the university take control of an entire platform? It's probably never going to work. I'd like to be proven wrong on that. I'm yet to be. And then you have specialist education platforms. So there are a couple of platforms. There was one called Hubbub. I'm not sure if they're still in operation. And there was another one called Crowdcube. And they worked with advancement at most universities. So they were set up as a sort of philanthropic platform that would enable alumni to give money back into projects at each university. And they had a kind of interesting strategy. So what they would do is you weren't necessarily funding specific projects. You would give money to advancement through the platform, and advancement would allocate your funds to projects on the basis of where advancement saw the need being. And it was also used to fund stipends and scholarships and things like that. So So less focused on the project outcomes and more focused on university level benefits. We worked at Deakin with Possible, the platform that's at the time was only about a year old. I'm very pleased to say Possible still exists and it's thriving. And what Possible did for us is they white labelled part of their website so that we could brand it for Deakin. But we found very quickly that most people are not very interested in giving money to an institution. They weren't particularly keen on giving money to Deakin. Quite frankly, they thought that Deakin was funded enough by the government, but they were very engaged by individual researchers. And it was the passion of individual researchers that really carried the projects. So when we first set out to start this program, Research My World, it was kind of funny because we put out a call for interest across the entire academic community at Deakin, and we mostly got responses from very senior researchers who, when they heard that the average amount of money that we felt people should be requesting was around $10,000, immediately abandoned us. You know, this was just like, why? And it's true. Why would someone who's a senior successful researcher who's capable of generating applications to government for massive amounts of funding, why would they want to do this? And consequently, in large part, they didn't. And what we got instead were generally people who were very passionate about their research, who were at typically early career stage, and who needed that step up. They needed something to break that would give them funding to get a project on the level. And from that, they were then able to amplify their success. And so in almost all cases, the people we funded went on to get further funding for either this project or a future project. Many of them went on to work in science communication as a direct result of doing this, and I'll get onto that in a minute. And so, you know, I think the alumni of the Research My World program have all gone on to do very interesting things and think very creatively around fundraising, both within the system and outside the system. So we ran our program over a period of around 4 years. We funded 20 research projects. We had an 83% success rate. We had a few fails in the first year. After that, we were 100% successful. Every campaign we launched succeeded. We raised about $180,000 in what we call new research funds. And what I mean by that is these were not funds that were already committed in some way by the government or by the university. These are genuinely new ways of bringing money into the system. So we're not taking money from anybody else. This is money that was not allocated to research previously. So it's effectively the coins on the sticky tape to the back of the envelope. This is money that's just come from outside the sector. We created over 2,300 donor events. So we used different strategies for getting or driving the fundraising. So a donor event might be a town hall meeting, it might be radio interviews, it might be television interviews. There's lots of different ways you can think about creating momentum around a project. And very successfully, something like 25,000 social media engagements and nearly 400 news stories. So one of the things I like to say about crowdfunding is that it's not so much the money, and the money is important to the researchers and it's obviously important to the investors. But from the broader university perspective, this is social media training by stealth. And effectively what we did is, it was almost Spartan technique. We took researchers and we sort of threw them over the side of the cliff and said, if you climb back up the cliff, you can have $10,000. And to get to the top, you have to tweet or set up social media profiles or get your story out into the community. And almost entirely they did. But it takes a very special kind of person to do that. And that's one of the tricks that, again, I'm going to talk about in a minute. But we became very good at recognising the people who would be able to succeed in that kind of an environment rather than the projects. So we weren't focused as much on the projects as we were on the people. And in a sense, that's a little bit like venture capital funding, where you invest in the entrepreneur as much as you're investing in their idea or their project. I think some universities haven't done that. They've focused on the projects. They've used a very conventional metric for success and failure or merit based around project parameters. And they are the universities that generally have not succeeded as much as we were able to. So this is the research site that Pozible set up for us, and they added research as a category to their various different fundraising taxonomies. So they would have, music, art, and so on and so on, and then research, which is really fantastic. So what were some of the project success factors? We did some regression analysis around the different projects that succeeded in the first couple of years, where we did have some failures. And we were able to determine that, in fact, one of the critical things was not just how much social media was produced by the researcher to get their project out into the community. It was how often those social media posts were shared. So that was the critical factor, and we were able to monitor that during campaigns. So we did. We would actually do, for example, network analysis of Twitter for each of the projects and advise teams as they were undertaking their projects on how to improve. So this is a Twitter network for a project that was reasonably successful, and here's one that was less successful because you'll see most of the Twitter activity occurred internally in the one on the left. Here's a nice representation of pledges and tweeting. And you'll see there's a reasonably interesting pattern of correlation there. And for the data nerds, you can have some assurance that that is in fact a useful piece of analysis. And here is the sort of overall pledge pattern by project and by year. So you can see that we do actually have, so each colour is a different year of possible activity for Deakin. But you'll see, for example, on the right-hand side, there's a pinky coloured cluster and a blue coloured cluster beneath, and quite a bit of crossover between those two projects. So one of the things we were able to do as well is determine that each of the project leaders was building a following, and they took that following with them if they set up a new project in the next year. And so this is also quite interesting, so that the public was invested, again, not just in the particular project, but in the researcher themselves, and they were making that connection to the researcher. So we have what we would call engagement-led research. And this is just some feedback from some of the participants who talked about how they become much more outward looking as academics, that they saw themselves as having a wide footprint in a kind of global sense, rather than just thinking about their research in their discipline or in their department. Challenges, the digital capacity of individual academics was very uneven. The digital capacity of academic institutions was also a major challenge. I will have it engraved on my gravestone that I got Deakin University a PayPal account. It nearly killed me. I nearly had that gravestone somewhat earlier than I thought. It was terrible, but we did succeed eventually. I think there's a difference between the kinds of campaigns that work for crowdfunding and those that have more of a sort of a research focus or an internal research focus. I think that university investments are typically made in particular silos, and this kind of crowdfunding activity really challenges that. You have to work across faculties and across disciplines. You have to work between different registers in the university, so between finance, admin staff, and academics who are not particularly senior, and so on. So there's a kind of bunch of questions there. There's also some very big questions. You know, what happens when personal and professional identities are blurred? That was particularly challenging to the researchers we worked with from the sciences, who felt that crowdfunding really encroached on their personal time, for example, that they had to work out of normal hours, and that we were asking them to build their base from the people that were most familiar to them, i.e. their friends or their family. They found that very off-putting, whereas in the humanities that was less of an issue. And so on. So, you know, I think there's some really interesting big questions there. There was a massively interesting question that was built around people who felt the government should fund research versus people who had an investment in solving a local or community issue and felt that they could intervene or should intervene. So there was often some really interesting stuff there that was also driven by discipline, because in the humanities, that's probably less. No one really ever really believes the government should fund the humanities deep down in their hearts, except people who work in the humanities. So that was never an issue with the crowd. You never had pushback from the crowd saying, but I really think the government should be funding your research. Whereas in the sciences, that happened a lot, where the crowd, the public would say, I really support this and I think it's a great idea, but I really think the government should be funding it, so I'm not going to. So there were some quite interesting disciplinary divisions. And now I've got a little bit more to talk about, but I'm aware that we're also coming up for discussion time. So I'll skip through some slides really quickly. So I apologise if this feels now like I'm rushing. I don't mean to, but I do want to get to discussion. So I don't want to kind of take up too much time. The second project that I worked on was a university-wide project that was generated by the Vice-Chancellor. So I was minding my own business one lovely weekend and having a nice time down by the beach, and the Vice-Chancellor rang me on my phone and said, I've had an idea and I'd like you to coordinate it. And of course, I had no choice but to say, yes, of course, Vice-Chancellor, I will do whatever you ask. And so the idea, as it turned out, was a really interesting one, and that was to work as a university to raise funds to support refugees who were being required by the government to reapply for their visa status. And we were working in conjunction with a regional legal centre who were going to provide translation and legal services to those refugees. So this is called Seeking Refuge. It was a 35-day crowdfunding campaign. We had a target of $70,000, so very large. We had a mixed working group coordinating it. This was a really interesting project because nobody wanted to tweet. It was a very different social media environment to be in. People in the legal service didn't want to tweet. We couldn't mention any specific names of any of the refugees that might benefit from, or any of their stories. So it was a very interesting campaign to work on, simply because there was a lack of detail around what we could promote. We did get quite a bit of traditional media support. And we also got the support of philanthropists. So here you have two of the kind of major philanthropists that operate in the Geelong area, and they agreed to provide matching funding. So if we could make a certain level of investment work with the public, they would then come in and match that funding. So we ended up with 408 donors, of which a significant number were either Deakin alumni or Deakin staff or Deakin students. And I think that this was a really interesting campaign from that level. And if you look here at the timeline, the dollars, which is the red line, you know, normally you have this, what we call valley of death. The blue line indicates the valley of death. The big spike in the middle of dollars is the philanthropic donors. So it's a huge donation, but it's just really a small number of donors, just two. And then again, right at the end to bring the project home. So we use the philanthropic donations to keep the project current and to keep things moving in the project and to ensure that it succeeded. So a lot of work went on behind the scenes to get these philanthropic dollars into the project. I won't dwell on any of these because I want to finish up. So the third and final example I want to give is the recent crowdfunding campaign we did at UTS. And this is a very different one. This is an internal crowdfunding platform. So this was not for the general public. This was a way of rethinking a very specific problem in one of the faculties at UTS. So I worked for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and the Dean had a budget for engagement to try and encourage staff in that faculty to make their work more public. So to use the funding to create exhibitions or other ways of thinking about non-research based publicity or promotion of research. So non-formal ways of thinking about that. Do a podcast, do an exhibition, go on the road with a lecture series, whatever it might be. And she had a problem, which was that the same 4 people kept applying for engagement funding and getting it every year. And she just felt that she was just directly injecting funding into 4 people's careers and not more broadly into the faculty, which had nearly 200 staff. So she asked for me to solve that problem. And what we did is we built the RAMP platform, this one, and I took her entire annual budget for engagement and I amortized it across the faculty. So all academic staff got an equal amount of real dollars that they could spend on a colleague's engagement project. And people would pitch those projects to their colleagues. And this had the advantage of solving several problems at once. Firstly, it meant everyone had much more awareness about the work their colleagues were doing. So we suddenly had a faculty where people were engaged with each other. People were able to actually take over the greenlighting process, so it wasn't an opaque individual deciding who got what money. All the money was transparently distributed, so everybody knew who was getting how much resource. And from my perspective, it was really super interesting because I could see which academics were the most outwardly generous. And I could use them as a model for the kind of behaviours that I would like to have fostered in the faculty. So we had about $38,000. We have lots of data about how that was spent. We see that the amount requested was far exceeded by the amount pledged. You can see here, if you look really closely, you have to kind of peer in at the screen like I am, the different projects and what they received. And how that was distributed across the different schools in the faculty. And that ended up becoming quite a successful project, and it ran for a couple of years. And in fact, we ended up experimenting with another faculty to try and see what we could do in terms of creating interdisciplinary research or engagement in this way as well. So that, and then of course, COVID hit, and that was the end of engagement funding as we know it. And the project didn't continue after that. But the principles, I think, were quite interesting and worked quite well. I just thought I'd share some screens with URLs with some of the resources that we used and developed with staff. And there's been quite a bit of publication around particularly the Deakin case study. So Jonathan O'Donnell used the Deakin case study for 2 articles that he's prepared, and I've also done a couple of articles with my colleague Stuart Palmer, who was one of the people I worked with at Deakin University on this project. And that's that.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Deb. So we might open up for questions. I might get us started. So something that came to me while you were talking was that people tend to give money to causes or to people or projects that they think that have the potential to actually make a difference or to do something that is useful to society. How do we as researchers, I guess, hold ourselves accountable to our crowdfunders by making sure that we are doing work with actual end user impact? Like, how answerable are you to the crowdfunders, especially in the models like all or none, or yeah.
Mhm.
So is there
Yeah, so
even a
yeah,
need for accountability there?
I think that's really interesting because the accountability is back onto the individual researchers in a public-facing way. So one of the things that you have to be very mindful of with crowdfunding, I think, is absolute and utter transparency, and that has to be philosophically embedded from the outset. So as a university administrator, for example, you need to be transparent with the researchers, and they need to be transparent with their investors or the people who commit funds to them. And so we did have projects where things took a lot longer. We had, for example, a film that was in part crowdfunded. So obviously the whole film wasn't, but some of the research was crowdfunded. And that film ended up taking 2 years longer than expected, as often happens with creative projects. But what they did is they had everyone's email addresses, and they wrote periodically to the people that funded them to thank them again and to let them know what was happening and where things were up to. And then eventually, when the film was released, they had a ready-made audience of people who were really committed to that particular film. So whereas, things go wrong when you're funded with government money, but the only person you're accountable to then is your finance, your research finance administrator, and you have to be transparent with them. And there's no repercussions on you if you don't deliver. If you tell the ARC you're going to solve or cure cancer, and then it just didn't happen this time round, but you did a lot of other interesting things, and you report that back. Only one person ever finds out about that or knows about that, or a handful of people. Whereas being publicly accountable can sometimes make you more conscious of your responsibilities to communicate what happens with research. So there's a really interesting level of research education that goes on as well to the public, which is quite good. In almost every case, people exceeded what they said that they would achieve.
Wonderful. I think it's also a great exercise in making sure that you are using these people's money to the best use or the end goal, because you have to be accountable so publicly. So I've got a few other questions, but I might open it up to the people here. Does anyone else have any questions?
Hi, Deb. I had a question. This is Herb Marsh. Hi.
Hi, Herb.
I was looking at the possibility of funding areas of research rather than specific research projects. And Rhonda's Indigenous research is a classic example. I would imagine that would be an attractive place to try and get some crowdsourcing. Now, she's got quite a bit of funding from ARC money, but could we top things up, or I guess maybe hive off a separate component or something like that was part of a larger research program? What would be your strategies in relation to that?
Yeah, I always think having a small component of a larger project is really helpful, because you can kind of say, and also scaffolding is really important. So because you're hoping to get more money than you ask for in general. So if you say, if I can raise $5,000, these are the things that I'll be able to do. If I can make it to 7,500, these are the things I'll be able to do. And if I can make it to 10,000, these are the amazing things I can do. And having some funding already can be reassuring to the public. I mean, you could, if you pitched it to say, the government recognises that this is a significant thing to understand or research, but they haven't provided money for this bit, which is critical or crucial or will help us in all these other ways. You are constantly up against, so the story that I told about a researcher being told, the government should fund research, that was a researcher called Mel Thompson, and she was looking into an endemic condition that was occurring in the Bellarine Peninsula where she lived, where there was a necrotic skin condition that was affecting typically small children, and it was quite scarring, and the treatments for it were terrible, and they still don't actually know what the cause of this is. And she was investigating whether using maggots to remove the dead flesh would be a better strategy than the surgical techniques that were being used at the time, which were awful, right? And so she wanted some research funding to assist with a clinical trial to look into that. So it was called the Mighty Maggots Project. And it was disgusting. It was really gross, but they had some really clever techniques for selling this project. One of which was they would have maggot races in a petri dish that, they would generate excitement about. They would get they had produced maggot artwork, so they would dip the maggots into non-toxic paints and get them to, move around a piece of paper, and then they would use those as incentives to get people to donate money. So they're very, very creative. And she was doing a town hall meeting, and a woman came up to her and said, "Oh, this is a really amazing project. My son had this condition. He was scarred for life. It ruined his confidence at school. It cost him in so many ways." And Mel, being a well-trained entrepreneur, said, "I'm so sorry to hear that. But if you would give us $10, it would go a long way towards helping us get to the bottom of this problem and create better treatments." And she said, "No, I won't give you $10 because the government should fund this." And Mel didn't have an answer for her because I don't think she'd actually kind of thought through that would be a response, And she thought about it later, and she said, "What I know is that this condition affects 0.012% of the Australian population. So the government's never going to make it a priority. But in this community, it affects a lot of people, and it is a priority. And if this community doesn't want to take ownership of solving the problem, no one will." Right? And of course, there are also major global benefits because it's a problem that's much more significant in other countries. But no one wants to think that broadly, particularly the Australian government, who pretty much only want to fund things that affect their voting base and their taxpayer base. So, this presents all sorts of interesting issues around this relationship between government funding of research and crowdfunding of research, and it is a tightrope that you have to walk very carefully, because if the public perceive that you're already well funded, they may feel that there's no urgency for them to give you any money. On the other hand, you can spin it to sort of say, no, everyone knows that this is really significant, but this is the part of the project that hasn't been funded and we really need it to be, and you need to have some engagement with it.
My initial thought when I was listening first, I heard about your presentation was whether or not we could support PhD scholarships. But from what you're saying, that it's really hard to get anywhere near enough money to do that. We might be able to top one up, but that would be the extent of it.
There have been some very successful campaigns in the research space. So, like endangered species tend to attract a lot of money. Like if you're trying to raise funding to preserve the habitat of a colourful parrot that's, on its last legs, you can sometimes really get significant amounts of money from the public. But in general, my advice is aim as small as you possibly can. And then you will be successful, right? And you may even be more than successful. We had many campaigns that raised 200% of what they originally asked for. But the beaut thing was that they got, and the other thing is, so we also had some university funding that we would tip in right at the end to get projects very close. You typically have this kind of valley structure to donations. You get a lot on your first day, and then it goes down, and then it flatlines. And that's the point at which most of the academics became despondent and often quite anxious and depressed, and we would spend a lot of time getting them through that valley of death. And then donations tick up again toward the end because you're getting to your deadline. And if we noticed that they weren't ticking up, we would throw in a very small amount of university funding, which I haven't counted in any of my data because it's not new funding. It's funding that, so we would often ask researchers, do you have some existing funding that could be repurposed for this? And we were always very transparent about it, because you need to be. This is not an exercise in money laundering, okay, which it could look like. So you need to be very, very, very honest and upfront and careful about that. But we would tip in a very small amount of funding to get that ticker toward the deadline going up, because people will abandon a project if they don't think it's going to tip over into a funded project. Whereas if it looks like it's going to tip into a funded project, suddenly everyone's like, oh yeah, this looks really great, and it's going to get, it just needs $5 more, I'll put that in. And there's a real psychology to it that's important to understand. So there's a few little tricks to the timing and the funding levels and donation levels, but so it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of funding up your sleeve. Is the answer to that.
It sounds like something that university execs would really need to be on board with, say for a researcher to go out and start crowdfunding. Have you come across any sort of barriers or have any tips to get them on board?
Yeah, you need a university champion, preferably someone at a DV level. So I was able to present a business case to the DVCR at Deakin, who, for reasons I still don't quite understand, went yes. Let's see how this goes. And because I had the DVCR backing me in, I was able to then get the changes across the rest of the university ecology to work. So when we needed to get the PayPal account set up and finance were resistant, I had a DVCR to help me. It could be your DVC responsible for engagement and advancement. It could be, it really depends where you go. But it is important to have someone who's both, so you need a champion who's someone like me or another senior academic who will drive the project, but you need institutional support at a very senior level, I think, for this to work. Otherwise, the other option is to do what many universities do, which is just turn a blind eye to academics doing their own crowdfunding. But then you're not bringing the money in-house, right? And so it starts to become a very grey area of financial administration if you have academics using the brand name to raise funding for projects where the money goes into their own bank account.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any tips on how to bring those champions on board?
It helps if they are social media stars, and it generally, so what I did is I had only recently arrived at Deakin when I pitched this project to the DVCR, but before I did that, I pretty much knew everyone at Deakin who knew how to use social media because I'd already been engaging with them. And so I just contacted them and asked them to meet with me, and we got together and went, this is a great idea, we'll all work on it together. And we all volunteered our labour. None of us got any compensation for it. But we saw it as a way of, well, I know why I did it. And the reason I was doing it was to intervene in what I saw as a kind of closed defensive network around research funding. At the time we set this up, if you were from an equity-seeking group, you could pretty much kiss goodbye any thought of getting ARC or NHMRC funding. It was almost impossible. And this was a really interesting way of crashing through the gatekeepers, really, by going directly out to the crowd. And that's really the pitch I made to the DVCR. What I hadn't realised is the extent to which this would also be about a whole bunch of other intangibles around engagement for early career academics.
Yeah, it does sound like a great way to help those, me being one of them, early career researchers get projects moving. So I've noticed we're out of time. Thank you so much. We do have one more question. People might have other meetings, so just before we maybe take a couple more questions, if Deb is happy to stay on, I'm just going to have everyone thank Deb for being here and for taking the time to talk to us about this area.
Thank you, everyone. I apologise for the slightly delayed start, which was a tech fail.
That's no worries. I think Teresa had a question, if you want to ask it now, Teresa.
Yes, first of all, thank you for the interesting presentation, Deb. And so I get that the whole crowdfunding exercise is about the crowd, so an individual giving. However, you did mention that there were some, I forgot the name, like the good people that give some larger amounts. But when, yeah, exactly. I don't know the word because it's so far away from what I am. But when is there must be a thin line of when the crowd that is giving money transitions from being an individual to being some kind of group giving money. So because I was thinking of in the research, my own research, I am partnering with lots of principal organizations, and the number is getting larger and larger, and they're not giving large amounts. For example, one of them only gives $3,000 a year for us to conduct research. And but it feels like we're collecting them, like we're collecting and gathering together, and so they're becoming a crowd. But is that still crowdsourcing? And
yes, so there's two models for that we engaged with in the period I was working at Deakin. One was we had an organisation that did a lot of work with a couple of researchers who did a lot of work with livestock related agencies and organisations. And what we decided to do is make those donations to their research public. So they set up a crowdfunding campaign, and then those agencies and organisations or small to medium enterprises gave money. And it was so transparent. I mean, this is the great thing about crowdfunding is everyone can see everyone who's donating. So you don't have some of the same ethical issues that you might have about research being funded by, interested parties who then affect the outcomes of the research because it's hidden, or the credibility of the research. This is all transparent, so it was great. And that particular campaign was successful to the tune of, I think, about 15,000, because those sort of $3,000 donations kicked in, but they were able to use the project as an engagement exercise more broadly. And they were able to get farmers engaged and other kinds of rural communities engaged. And we had one other really interesting case of a particular research project on, I'm going to say it was on some kind of neurological condition, which I can't remember. I became an expert in so many things, like in particular in seaweed in Warrnambool, but that's another story. But so this particular neurological condition is quite rare, and they wanted to do some research around it. And they were contacted by this guy who represented a group of investors who had money to spend before the end of the tax year on a donation. And one of them had a distant relative with this condition, and he had heard or read about it somewhere and decided that he would get all his friends that were represented by the same accountant to all tip in a small amount of money. And then the accountant came and said, I've got $12,000 of funding from all these different investors that I would like to donate to this project. How do we do it? So that was also a really interesting example of the crowd self-organizing. Mm-hmm. So the person who had read the project then created another kind of project, I guess, which then donated to the research. So that was really interesting. And the last example is the seaweed one. So the seaweed one was really interesting. Warrnambool is the most seaweedy place in the world. Deakin has a campus there. There's a lot of marine science that occurs down there. There was a woman down there who was married to a Japanese guy, and she was preparing dinner one night using seaweed that had been imported from Japan. And she was like, why am I cooking seaweed from Japan when if I walk down to the beach, the beach is covered in seaweed? What are we doing in this country around food sustainability when we have this plentiful resource? So she wanted to set up a taste testing trial on local seaweed, and she ended up engaging the entire Warrnambool community. It was unbelievable, right? So she went from being this shy, retiring researcher in a lab coat behind the test tubes into being like a media celebrity who got mobbed every time she went down the street in Warrnambool. And she wrote up her stuff in Facebook and in Twitter, and she was interviewed on the ABC, like all sorts of stuff. And she eventually got contacted by venture capitalists from China who run the big seaweed production facilities off the coasts of China to work out if they could engage with her research in an Australian environment. So you just don't know what that tipping point is for some researchers. For some people, it will just be a bunch of very invested or interested extended family members. And then you get the Chinese venture capitalists knocking on the door because you're putting it out there. Whereas if she had published her research in a peer-reviewed paper in English in a paywalled journal that was run by Elsevier, that would never have happened.
Yeah.
Not in a million years. So it's a great question because, yes, the crowd, I focused a lot on individual researchers because in the large part, the majority of donations are, $50 or under. But that's not to say that the possibility for larger donations doesn't exist. And I think that the small to medium enterprise space is completely underutilised in Australian research. And this is a great way for them to engage.
Yep. Thank you.
I've noticed that there's a hand up from campus that might have been before 1:30, but is there a question there?
Hi. Thanks, Deb, and thank you. So I'm Claire. I've just started in the Institute this week, but it's so fascinating, and I'm just thinking, does that mean that there's a huge opportunity for researchers to connect with advancement and alumni areas across the university to partner with potential donors so that they can say, right, I'd really like to support this type of research? So it opens up a whole new avenue of connection with philanthropy in universities.
Yes, so that's been an interesting development in this space. So we originally began at Deakin working through the DVCR, but by the time I finished at Deakin, the locus of influence had shifted to advancement, and so there'd been some kind of really for the DVCR, this is small fry. Like we made, 180 grand or something. That's, not even morning tea money in most DVCR's imaginations. And that's over 5 years, and it took a lot of work and a lot of voluntary labour to raise that kind of money. And so from a senior academics perspective, senior university executives perspective, this is not it's not an effective way to meet your KPIs. From the individual researcher's perspective, it is. So, when you flip it to the other end of the spectrum, it's incredibly meaningful and it changes lives. And the 30 or 40 people that engaged with my crowdfunding program have all gone on to have amazing lives as a result, not as a direct result of this, but this is part of what made them who they ended up being. But from the DVCR's perspective, 180 grand, I could make that by picking the phone up, so that versus 5 years of constant, stress and anxiety about fundraising. So, but for advancement, there are some keen advantages because of the very large number of donors you end up dealing with. So instead of dealing with one person who gives 180 grand, you're dealing with, 400 people that have given $10. And as anyone in advancement will tell you, the first donation is always the most important donation because that's where you've brought them in. We did have some interesting problems, however, around this, and I'll kind of caution you around some of this stuff. So advancement, who were very enthusiastic about our lovely long list of donors, sent out an email at one point for a general university campaign, fundraising campaign, to that list of donors. And that list of donors, we got a lot of pushback from them because they said that they had only given money not to Deakin, but to an individual researcher, that they were supporting an individual researcher, and they were unhappy about being contacted by the institution because they didn't support the institution. And we had to have words with advancement because of also the Privacy Act, and just say, you can't do that again. So from advancement's perspective, they had to tread more carefully around this. Like, we ended up on our donations page having a check button, like, would you like to be contacted by Deakin University about other opportunities, tick. That would also be solved if this were a more top-down process. We really drove it as a bottom-up process, that the researcher was the key figure, that was the key person with the greatest investment in the project succeeding. But if you did this through advancement, there are other ways of structuring it. Like you can say, here's 7 priority areas for the university, tick which one you'd like your $10 to, and they might be slightly more broad categories than a specific project. Or here's 6 projects we self-selected, we prepared earlier, and you can help them complete their projects. Or you could even do like a Patreon kind of thing of, this year we're supporting these 3 early career researchers to get started, bang, 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 and give them $5 a month or $10 a month or whatever. So I think there would be lots of different ways you could manage this through advancement, and they could be quite creative and interesting.
Yes.
And yes, it does open you up then to also getting that Seeking Refuge campaign was really interesting, because that's the campaign I worked most closely with advancement on. And they really did help us find those 2 major philanthropists.
Yeah.
That's their specialty in their field. It's not mine. So they went to them and pitched and got the commitment and managed the relationship. Not me, which was great. But we worked quite closely because of the timing issue, like trying to get those spikes happening.
Yeah.
And that was, in the end, it worked really, really well. But it did take quite a bit of kind of mapping of the different backgrounds that I had and they had around that project.
Yes. But I imagine this is almost like this is the way of the future. This is the beginning of the way that universities can have that alternative sort of. I don't see as much activity happening in this space right now. I think maybe COVID put a dent in, the notion of a crowd being somewhat dangerous, not quite the safe harbour that we've all come to think of it as. What about in the US? I mean, is it taken off there?
I think there's more of a tradition in the US of donating to your your alumni association to a university, and so they have different. It's a very different or vastly different kind of arrangement there. Most of the stuff I see in the US is really driven through advancement and philanthropy, whereas in the UK it tended to be driven through enterprise, so it would tend to be more attached to courses, and particularly like trying to get students to be more entrepreneurial, for example, or trying to get matching funds happening. That was a couple of years ago. I'm not quite sure what that looks like now, but I did a spot of research over the last couple of days, and it feels to me like this space has gone quiet. And I wonder if that's not because we're now much more focused on equity funding, which is where the big dollars are. So, setting up a spin-off, company, thinking about that in terms of crowdfunded equity funding might work really well, I think. And that would attract the attention of your DVCR rather than your DVCA or engagement, DVCE, whatever the acronym is at every different university.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Deb, for joining us today and for providing such great insight into the crowdfunding and area of funding and finding money. And hopefully we can use this in the future to support younger researchers as well as bigger projects.
Keep me in touch with where you end up heading, because I'd love to help you out, and I can offer some resources and so on. So please let me know how you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
No problem. Bye, everyone. Thank you.